Imagine a world where truth no longer exists, not because people stop believing in it, but because the very foundation of truth itself collapsed, where every grand story humanity ever told about progress, reason, and meaning crumbled into fragments, where reality became a construction, where certainty dissolved into endless interpretation. This isn't science fiction. This is postmodernism. And whether you realize it or not, you're living inside it. The story of postmodernism is the story of the 20th century's greatest philosophical revolution, a seismic shift that changed how we understand truth, power, identity, and reality itself. It began in the ashes of the Second World War. It spread through universities, art galleries, and eventually into the fabric of everyday life. Today, its influence is everywhere, in your social media feed, in political discourse, in debates about identity and truth. But what is postmodernism? Where did it come from? And how did a philosophical movement reshape the world? This is that story. The death of Grand Narratives Europe, 1945. The war is over. 6 years of devastation have ended. 50 million people are dead. The Holocaust has revealed the darkest capabilities of human civilization. Atomic bombs have demonstrated our power to annihilate ourselves. And in the aftermath, intellectuals are asking a terrible question. How did this happen? The Enlightenment promised reason would liberate humanity. Science would conquer ignorance. Progress would lead to utopia. These were the grand narratives that defined modernity. But reason created the death camps. Science built the bombs. Progress led to genocide. The grand narratives failed. This is where postmodernism begins. Not with a philosophy, with a crisis. French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard would later define postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives, a distrust of the big stories, the universal explanations. Christianity promised salvation. Marxism promised equality. Capitalism promised prosperity. Science promised truth. Postmodernism asks, what if all these stories are just that? Stories, not objective truths, not universal laws, just narratives constructed by those in power to maintain control. This wasn't cynicism. It was a response to historical trauma. If reason and progress could produce Auschwitz, then maybe reason and progress themselves needed to be questioned. The architecture of doubt. To understand postmodernism, we must first understand what came before. Modernism. The modernist project was about order, clarity, universal truths, clean lines, and rational design. In architecture, this meant buildings like Mies van der Rohe's glass towers. Simple, functional, stripped of ornament, form follows function. In philosophy, it meant seeking foundations, building knowledge from the ground up, finding certainty. Descartes sought it in the cogito, Kant sought it in the categories of understanding. The logical positivists sought it in empirical verification. Modernism believed in capital T truth, but postmodernism questioned the very possibility of such truth. The shift became visible first in architecture. The clean modernist boxes began to feel sterile, inhuman, alienating. In 1972, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis was demolished, a massive modernist public housing project. It had won awards. It was supposed to be the future. Instead, it became unlivable, crime-ridden, abandoned. Architectural critic Charles Jenks famously declared that modernism died on July 15, 1972, at 3:32 p.m., the moment Pruitt-Igoe was destroyed. What emerged in its place was postmodern architecture, buildings that mixed styles, that referenced history playfully, that rejected the idea of one correct way to build. The AT&T building in New York, with its Chippendale pediment atop a modern skyscraper, ironic, self-aware, mixing high and low culture. This was the postmodern aesthetic, pastiche, irony, the collapse of distinction between high art and popular culture. But architecture was just the surface. The real revolution was happening in philosophy. The linguistic turn language doesn't describe reality. Language creates reality. This idea would become central to postmodernism. Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure laid the groundwork decades earlier. He demonstrated that linguistic signs are arbitrary. The word tree has no natural connection to the thing we call a tree. Meaning emerges from difference, from contrast. Cat means something only because it isn't bat or mat. This seems simple, but the implications are radical. If language is a system of differences, then meaning is never fixed, never stable, always dependent on context. And if we can only think through language, then our access to reality is always mediated, always interpreted, never direct. There is no stepping outside language to check if our words match reality. We're trapped in the house of language. Jacques Derrida took this further with deconstruction. Any text, Derrida argued, contains internal contradictions, tensions, meanings that undermine its own claims. Read closely enough, and every philosophical system deconstructs itself. Take the binary oppositions Western philosophy relies on: speech versus writing, presence versus absence, man versus woman. These aren't neutral categories. One term is always privileged. Speech is considered more authentic than writing, presence more real than absence, but Derrida showed that the privileged term actually depends on the subordinate term. You can't have speech without the possibility of writing, can't have presence without the concept of absence. The hierarchy collapses, the foundation crumbles. This wasn't just about texts, it was about reality itself. If our concepts are structured by language and language is unstable, then so is reality. There is no transcendent truth waiting to be discovered, only interpretations, all the way down. Power and knowledge. Michel Foucault asked a different question. Who benefits from what counts as truth? Foucault traced the history of madness, sexuality, punishment, and the human sciences. He revealed how what we consider truth is tied to systems of power. The insane weren't always locked in asylums. That's a relatively recent practice, beginning in the 17th century. Why? Not because we suddenly discovered scientific truth about mental illness, but because society needed to manage populations, to separate the productive from the unproductive. Knowledge about madness served power. The same with sexuality. The Victorians didn't repress sex, Foucault argued. They proliferated discourse about it, medical categories, psychological classifications, confessions. All this talk about sex was a way of controlling it, of making it manageable, of producing docile subjects. Power doesn't just repress, power produces. It produces what counts as knowledge, what counts as normal, what counts as true. This was revolutionary. Traditional philosophy assumed power distorts truth, that if we could just remove bias and ideology, we'd access pure knowledge. Foucault said no, power and knowledge are inseparable. Every claim to truth is also a move in a game of power. There's no neutral position, no view from nowhere. This has profound implications. If truth is tied to power, then who decides what's true? The universities, the media, the government, the corporations, the institutions. And those institutions serve particular interests. They include some voices, exclude others. Postmodernism became a tool for the marginalized, for feminists questioning male-centered knowledge, for post-colonial theorists challenging Western universalism, for queer theorists deconstructing fixed categories of identity. If truth is constructed, then it can be reconstructed differently. The Desert of the Real, Jean Baudrillard, took postmodernism to its most extreme conclusion. We live in a world of simulations, copies without originals, images with no reference to reality. Baudrillard called this the hyperreal, a condition where the map precedes the territory, where representation becomes more real than reality itself. Think about Disneyland. It presents itself as fantasy, as fake. But Baudrillard argued this is precisely what makes the rest of America seem real by comparison. Disneyland exists to conceal the fact that all of America is Disneyland, that the real country is just as much a simulation. Or consider the Gulf War. Baudrillard controversially argued the Gulf War did not take place, not literally, but as a media event. It was so carefully staged, so sanitized, so transformed into images that it became hyper-real. We experienced not the war, but the simulation of war. Today this is obvious. We scroll through Instagram, seeing curated versions of lives, filtered, edited, more perfect than reality. We mistake the simulation for the truth. Politicians don't govern, they perform governance. Brands don't sell products, they sell lifestyles, images. The boundary between real and fake has dissolved. We're lost in the desert of the real, surrounded by mirages with no way to distinguish authentic from counterfeit. The postmodern condition. By the 1980s and 1990s, postmodernism had escaped academia. It was in art, music, film, television, fashion. David Lynch's films depicted fractured narratives and unstable identities. The Simpsons used irony and self-reference. MTV created a culture of rapid-fire images and pastiche. Everything became quotation marks. Nothing was sincere. In literature, authors like Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo created sprawling, paranoid narratives where conspiracy and meaning always remained just out of reach. Postmodern novels were self-conscious. They acknowledged they were novels. They played with the reader. They rejected the idea of a single authoritative interpretation. In politics, postmodernism manifested as identity politics. If there's no universal human nature, then identity becomes central. Race, gender, sexuality, these aren't natural categories. They're constructed and therefore contestable. This led to heated debates. Critics said postmodernism was destroying universal values, fragmenting society into tribal identities, making rational debate impossible. Defenders said it was giving voice to the voiceless, challenging oppressive universals that were always particular, always white, always male, always Western. The culture wars had begun. Conservative thinker Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind, warning that relativism was destroying education. Postmodernists responded that Bloom's universal truth was just one more power play, an attempt to impose Western values as if they were natural. Neither side could find common ground, because they didn't share the same premises about truth and reality. The science wars. The conflict reached academia with what became known as the science wars. Postmodern scholars argued that even science was socially constructed, that facts aren't simply discovered, but produced within particular cultural contexts. Scientists reacted with outrage. In 1996, physicist Alan Sokal published a hoax article in a postmodern cultural studies journal. It was filled with deliberate nonsense, references to quantum gravity and social constructivism mashed together meaninglessly. The journal published it. Sokal revealed the hoax. He argued postmodernism had become so divorced from reality, so drunk on jargon, that it couldn't distinguish sense from nonsense. Postmodern scholars responded that Sokal misunderstood the argument. Nobody was saying gravity isn't real. They were saying how we talk about gravity, how we understand it, how we use it. All this is culturally embedded. Scientific facts are real, but scientific practice is human. Social, historical, the debate revealed the deep divide. Scientists saw postmodernism as dangerous relativism. Postmodernists saw science as naively assuming its own neutrality. But both sides made a mistake. They treated postmodernism as monolithic, as if all postmodern thinkers said the same thing. They didn't. Derrida never denied reality. He questioned our ability to access it with certainty. Foucault wasn't a relativist. He was a historian showing how truth claims function in social contexts. Lyotard didn't reject knowledge. He rejected the idea that one grand theory could explain everything. The caricature of postmodernism, that it claims nothing is true, everything is subjective, was never what the best postmodern thinkers actually said. But the caricature stuck. The digital age. Then came the internet, and suddenly postmodern philosophy became lived reality. Online identity is fluid. You can be anyone. Truth becomes contested. Everyone has their own facts, their own narrative. Social media platforms create echo chambers, communities with their own language games, their own truth regimes. Foucault's insights about power and knowledge become visible. Algorithms decide what counts as true, what gets amplified, what gets suppressed. Baudrillard's hyperreality is everywhere. We live through screens, experience events as media, confuse the map for the territory. Conspiracy theories flourish, not because people are stupid, but because in a postmodern landscape, grand narratives have collapsed. People construct alternative narratives to make sense of chaos. QAnon, Flat Earth, Deep State. These are attempts to find meaning in a world where official narratives have lost credibility. The 2016 election introduced the term post-truth, a condition where emotional appeals trump facts, where lies repeated become truth. Politicians discovered they could simply deny reality, create alternative narratives, and large numbers of people would believe them. This seems like postmodernism run amok. Truth doesn't matter anymore. Everything is interpretation. Everything is constructed. But is this what postmodernism actually wanted? The backlash. A new generation of critics emerged. Psychologist Jordan Peterson called postmodernism a destructive ideology, a threat to Western civilization. He argued postmodernists were neo-Marxists, that they'd given up on economic revolution and turned to cultural revolution instead. Identity politics was Marxism in disguise. This wasn't quite accurate. Most postmodern thinkers were critical of Marxism. They rejected its grand narrative of class struggle and historical inevitability. But Peterson touched a nerve. Many people felt postmodernism had gone too far, that it had led to a kind of paralysis, where nothing could be said without offense, where every statement was deconstructed into power dynamics. Universities became battlegrounds, debates about free speech, safe spaces, trigger warnings. To critics, this was proof postmodernism created fragility, inability to handle disagreement. To defenders, it was about recognizing that speech isn't neutral, that words have power, that marginalized people have historically been silenced. The debate continues, more heated than ever. But something interesting happened. In fighting postmodernism, critics often deployed postmodern tactics. They questioned mainstream narratives, deconstructed institutional authority, claimed the media was creating hyperreal simulations. They accused postmodernists of the very thing postmodernism warned against, claiming universal truth while advancing particular interests. The irony was lost on no one. What postmodernism actually was. Here's the truth about postmodernism. It wasn't a unified movement. It was a mood, a sensibility, a set of questions. Different thinkers emphasized different aspects, had different politics, reached different conclusions, but they shared a skepticism about grand narratives, a recognition that what we call truth is always partial, always situated, always tied to power and context. This wasn't nihilism, it was humility. The recognition that we see through a glass, darkly, that our knowledge is finite, that we should be wary of anyone claiming absolute certainty. At its best, postmodernism opened space for voices that had been excluded, for perspectives that challenged dominant narratives, for creativity that rejected rigid boundaries. At its worst, it descended into relativism, into the idea that all perspectives are equally valid. That truth is whatever you make it. But that was never the point. The point was to question, to investigate, to reveal the constructed nature of what appears natural. Not to deny reality, but to understand that our access to reality is always mediated, always interpreted, always incomplete. The aftermath. Today, postmodernism is dead, or so we're told. Philosophers speak of post-postmodernism, metamodernism, the new sincerity. A younger generation rejects postmodern irony. They want authenticity, meaning, purpose. They see postmodernism as the ideology of their cynical, disconnected parents, a paralyzing relativism that prevents action. Climate change requires belief in objective truth, in scientific consensus, in universal human interests. You can't deconstruct your way out of ecological collapse. But maybe reports of postmodernism's death are exaggerated. Maybe we're not post-postmodern. Maybe we're in late postmodernism, where its insights have become common sense. We all understand now that identities are constructed, that media manipulates, that authority should be questioned. We're all postmodern now, whether we like it or not. The challenge is integrating postmodern insights without falling into paralysis, acknowledging that truth is constructed without concluding that truth doesn't matter. This is the task of the 21st century. Lessons from the ruins. What can we learn from postmodernism? First, be skeptical of anyone claiming absolute truth, especially when that truth serves their interests. Second, recognize that knowledge is always situated. What's true from one perspective might look different from another. This isn't relativism. It's recognizing the limits of our own viewpoint. Third, understand that categories are constructed: race, gender, sanity. These aren't natural kinds, they're human creations, and because they're created, they can be changed. Fourth, be aware of how power shapes what counts as knowledge. Who gets to speak? Who gets heard? Who's excluded? Fifth, don't confuse critique for destruction. Questioning foundations isn't the same as demolishing them. Sometimes you have to take apart a structure to understand how it works. Finally, balance skepticism with commitment. Yes, our beliefs are fallible. Yes, truth is elusive. But we still have to make choices. Take stands. Build something. Perfect knowledge is impossible, but good enough knowledge is achievable, and good enough is enough to act. The future of truth. We live in strange times. The postmodern critique of truth has been weaponized, used to spread misinformation, to deny science, to justify authoritarianism. When everything is constructed, those with power do the constructing. This isn't what postmodern philosophers intended, but it's what happened. The question now is whether we can salvage postmodernism's insights while avoiding its pitfalls. Can we acknowledge that truth is constructed without giving up on truth altogether? Can we recognize that knowledge is tied to power without concluding that knowledge is nothing but power? Can we embrace multiple perspectives without descending into relativism? These are the questions we must answer, because the alternative is worse. Either we retreat to a naive faith in absolute truth, ignoring everything postmodernism taught us, or we surrender to a nihilism where nothing matters. Neither option is acceptable. We need a new synthesis, a way of thinking that acknowledges construction while insisting on reality, that recognizes situated knowledge while reaching toward universals, that embraces humility while maintaining conviction. This won't be easy. It requires holding contradictions, living with uncertainty, making judgments without certainty, but that's what being human means. We build meaning in a world that offers no guarantees. We seek truth knowing we'll never possess it completely. We act despite uncertainty. Postmodernism showed us the limits of reason. Now we must learn to think beyond those limits, not by abandoning reason, but by supplementing it with imagination, ethics, community. The grand narratives are dead. Long live the small stories we tell each other, the local truths we construct together, the provisional meanings we create in the face of chaos. This is the world postmodernism left us. Now we must decide what to do with it. The question remains, so what is truth? Is it something discovered or something created? Is it absolute or relative, universal or particular? Postmodernism doesn't answer these questions. It refuses to, because it suspects the questions themselves are the problem. Maybe truth isn't one thing, maybe it's many things. Different modes of truth for different domains. Scientific truth, moral truth, aesthetic truth, personal truth, each with its own logic, its own standards, its own validity. Or maybe the whole framework is wrong. Maybe we need new categories entirely. Postmodernism opened the door to these questions, but it couldn't walk through. That's our task now, to think in the ruins, to build on the fragments, to create something new from the pieces of what came before. The age of certainty is over. We know that now, but the age of meaning doesn't have to be. We can live without absolute truth, as long as we have something worth believing in, something worth fighting for, something worth building together. The question is, what will that be? What do you think truth is? Something we discover or something we create?